Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I have Jessica Koehler. Jessica is a school psychologist and has a PhD in school psychology from the University of Maryland. She has done a whole bunch of work in her career, some practical, some research based. She has been a school psychologist in a variety of public schools and she in various states. And she currently is the proud parent and teacher to her two boys, in which she homeschools them, which we talk about in the conversation. She has a very thriving YouTube channel and KoehlerAcademy.com, which is her website, where she has so much information. She also writes for the blog at Psychology Today. So she is doing a whole heck of a lot and really is a good educator and a good educator for common folk, for students at all different levels. So I was really pleased that she agreed to come on and agreed to talk to me. And I've been wanting to get the school psychology world on the podcast and couldn't think of anybody better to chat with about that. In the conversation, we talk about her background and how she became involved with school psychology and how she ended up where she is at the moment. We talk about where school psychology fits within the world of psychology. We start talking about this heavy emphasis on school psychologists and how they're required to diagnose in almost this reactionary way. We talk about some of the elements of what it means to be a school psychologist and what are the pressures to, also in some ways educate, to assess, and to try and provide some type of care for children in school. We talked about the need and focus for preventative measures within schools. We had a really nice conversation on the element of school choice. And then we talked about the various alternative forms of learning. And we gave a long discussion on her experiences, homeschooling, and we talked about some of the criticisms about that. And then we talked about my own experiences with homeschooling. So that was pretty cool. And then we kind of ended the conversation about the necessity to be able to explain psychology and to explain social science to the everyday man or woman, and to make sure that science and the field of psychology is understandable without watering it down. Jessica is a lovely person, super brilliant, and has such a very warm, uplifting spirit that is almost infectious. She was absolutely so much fun to talk to for over 2 hours, and I learned a lot and got a lot out of it. And so now I bring you Jessica Koehler. I am here with Jessica Koehler. Jessica, how's it going?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Yeah, doing pretty good. Time change is treating everybody interestingly, I think.
Yes.
And today is, as you reminded me, is the Ides of March. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a very interesting date.
Beware. Uh-oh, I better beware.
Yeah. So tell listeners about yourself. Tell us what you do, what your research you've done, what your current interests are, what you write about, all that good stuff. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. It's been a long and twisted road, kind of. I'll start all the way back at the beginning.
Sure.
I'll start kind of with undergrad kind of degree in psychology. I am a psychologist. And then I went on to get a PhD in school psychology from the University of Maryland. Yay.
Yes, I'm very happy about that. Go Terps. Very happy about that.
And I actually worked as a school psychologist before I went back and got my doctorate in psychology, my PhD. And which was really, really a great thing for me to do, to learn more about what I wanted to go into and focus on in terms of research. I initially got like a master's in what's called an educational specialist degree in school psychology, and worked as a school psychologist, which is something people kind of hear about a little bit, but I don't know that they necessarily know what that is. And I think oftentimes people get confused about school psychologists versus school counselors, for sure. Like most people, even many people in my family thought forever that's what I was doing. And school psychology is a little bit different. It's more like a melding of a clinical and educational psychologist within the school setting. A lot of what I did, especially early on as a school psychologist, is a lot of assessments, lots and lots of IQ testing, achievement testing, diagnosis and such, especially diagnosis for learning disabilities and ADHD and things like that. Some counseling, a lot of developing interventions for kids who are struggling, some testing for giftedness and things like that. And I kind of, working for a couple of years in the school, I realized I wanted to be a researcher. So I decided to go back and get my PhD and kind of lucked into an amazing research project at the University of Maryland. I had two of the most unbelievable advisors, and they, just before I got there, had gotten this huge NIH grant and took me on as sort of like the head research assistant, because I was a little bit older at that point, than few years older than most of the students that were just out of undergrad, and became part of a big project that led to my dissertation research. And really what it was focused on was what was called instructional consultation. Dr. Sylvia Rosenfield came up with this process called instructional consultation to work with teachers in schools to kind of look beyond just the diagnosis. I had gotten kind of frustrated as a school psychologist with just diagnosing all the time when any child was struggling. In some ways, in some schools, the only way they could get assistance was if they had a diagnosis. And it was something I really didn't feel like was the right thing, which is one of the reasons I wanted to go back and get my PhD. And I lucked into this project where Dr. Rosenfield had developed this program where it was really going in and working with the teachers to help the teachers develop their skills and change their mindsets a little bit about the students they were working with. And, I became really, really interested in teacher beliefs. My dissertation was about teacher efficacy, like teachers' confidence in their ability to, in their instructional practices on one hand. And really what I became very focused on was, they call it teacher efficacy, but in a lot of ways it comes from the strain of like more locus of control, which is still something I'm very interested in, that locus of control more globally. But at that point, I was really interested in teacher locus of control and to what extent teachers felt that they could have an impact, have an effect on students that came from all different backgrounds, students that had learning disabilities, that kind of thing. And what was fascinating about the research that we did, it was like a 3-year-long study that I was a part of, and I developed my own survey instrument and to measure teacher sort of locus of control, teacher efficacy kind of combined together. And we found that the instructional consultation team intervention actually changed teacher beliefs. And it was a true experimental design. I utilized, hierarchical linear modeling. I had 1,200 teachers that had responded. So it was really, really interesting research. And I, thought I was going to become a professor. That's where this story's heading. And then I got pregnant, and life took a more personal turn. And I still was, working on the research and still thinking that's what I was going to do. I actually got pregnant when I was finishing my dissertation. Finished my dissertation a year early, fascinatingly, before my internship.
I never hear that story. I always hear it's always a year or two later. So
yeah, I actually enjoyed doing it. I like statistics and research and stuff. So, and then at the end of my internship, I got pregnant with our second son, and everything changed. And I realized I needed to take some time. Our kids were a little bit, we get some parents are able to just kind of roll with things and, get right back in there and stuff. But we had some kids that didn't sleep for 3 years each. So that was like 6 years I had of. And apparently there must be some genetic effect because my mother-in-law said my husband was exactly the same way. So we'll blame him. But my husband's career was taking off at that point too. And so I took some time off. And then, by the time our younger son was about 4, I realized, I was really missing being involved in, academia and stuff like that. And I started, teaching as an adjunct at Santa Clara University and got really into teaching just intro psych. I just love introductory psychology. It's funny because a lot of instructors don't, right? I don't know about you. Do you like intro?
It's mostly boring because you can teach it in different ways. Most of the time it's boring just because you can't really get into anything at any great length. Which is kind of frustrating because it's like here's most of the stuff you need to know about this. And if you want to learn more about it, then there's all these classes for this and this and this and this. So it is very much a survey, but I've heard people structure it differently and they make it really fun and really interesting. So.
Well, yeah, it's definitely, there's a lot of breadth and in some ways not a lot of depth. And I've gotten more used to figuring out fun ways to make sure the information connects, because I remember the first time I took intro psych, it was so confusing. I didn't understand how all these like disparate fields were kind of related together under one topic. So I really try to make sure that students understand and can make the connections. And I actually think of myself, although my PhD is in school psychology, I may have mentioned this to you before, I kind of think of myself more now as sort of a psychological generalist, because I do love learning about so many different disciplines within psychology, and it does seem kind of rare. Like most people have a really, a really kind of focus, and I like taking information. And as I teach over and over again, intro psych, and I've been teaching also some AP psychology, which is just the same thing, right? It's intro psych at the high school level. And I've been teaching to gifted individuals. And that's been a fascinating experience to like some of these kids that are like 16 years old that are, they've blown me away in terms of writing better than graduate students. A lot of kids that are in the homeschooling community, actually, which we're going to talk about how I get to that. But so then, I got back into teaching. And then, got into writing, and I write for Psychology Today, and I write, my blog is called Beyond School Walls, and it's, has a bunch of different meanings to me. That the title of the blog, basically, I kind of pride myself on being someone that likes to learn sort of autodidactically, like learning a ton on my own in multiple areas, diving deeply into all different subject areas. And so the Beyond School Walls is sort of to like note that, like learning outside of school, because sometimes we think that, once our schooling is done, we're done learning. But, just also to talk about how, like our family has made a journey from me being a public school psychologist, thinking our kids were going to go through the public schools, to ending up being a homeschool family. So I talk a bit about that as well within my blog. And, I also, now I've converted to teaching sort of online classes, because I do homeschool our two boys, and I'm involved in some research. I'm a member of a board for the National Association for Gifted Children, and doing some research connected, I just presented to them and looking at some of the different ways in which we can better meet the needs of gifted learners. So especially our older son, who you've seen on Twitter a little bit, he's homeschooled, as well as our younger son, and he is, very academically advanced. And it's been really an interesting journey to watch how that unfolds, and how homeschooling has really helped him be able to sort of like create his own path. And he's, so motivated about what he's learning, and he's taken on so much self-direction and all that. So that's been a really interesting thing. And for our younger son, we ended up homeschooling him actually first because of some struggles that he had in the school setting. He was the wiggly worm little boy who was falling out of his seat. And it was fascinating to me coming into it. I had never had any meetings at this school about our older son, because he never had any behavior issues or any problems at all. But our younger son, first 2 weeks of school, it was like, we need to come in and talk to the principal. And I was always the school psychologist on the other side of the table. So it was fascinating to kind of get the other side of the equation and see what parents go through and stuff. It was a really good learning experience for me. And at that point, we kind of determined he was really bright, but he was having some behavioral and emotional struggles. So we decided to homeschool for a year, and it just sort of took off from there. So.
I'm curious. You absolutely do not have to answer if you don't want to. I'm typically a fairly private person, especially with my family. So you do not have to answer if you don't want to. Although since you brought him up, I'm curious. You said that your oldest, I get this confused, is academically advanced. Can you say how so, or how, in what ways, or how would you?
Oh, sure. I mean, the story goes back really far, but I'll start right now. He just turned 14, and he's taking like AP calculus classes and physics, and he teaches his own online classes. So he teaches classes through an online vendor that's actually focused towards gifted students. He teaches classes on British monarchs, American presidents, Roman. It's really into history at this point, but he's into a lot of subjects. He's always been very talented at math. If you want to, like, from a very early age, it was evident that he was just super intensely interested in academic content, to the point that we had originally put him in like a play-based preschool because everyone talks about how awesome play-based preschools are. And that is what my younger son needed. But for Alex, our older son, I talk about him all the time. I'm fine talking about it. We tried a play-based preschool and it was terrible. He wanted to sit and read books, and we found a preschool that was, kind of accommodated him, and it was awesome. They gave him like all kinds of really intensive academic workbooks that were several years ahead when he was 4 years old. And that's what he wanted and needed at that point. He was a kid who, before he went to kindergarten, he'd memorized the location and could identify every country on the earth, right? He can still do it. Like he memorized, like, it was fascinating to see the level of his memory. And that's what he wanted to do, I have a younger son. Our other son is so different than that. So it's been such a as a psychologist, it's been so fascinating to watch it unfold, because we've always had, well, how did you get him to read Harry Potter when he was in kindergarten? I'm like, we didn't. And I couldn't get our younger son to do it. That's just that was what he was into. Right. Like, and he's still like that at nighttime. He chooses to read like nonfiction books. Last night he was reading a book about the Roman Empire, or he was reading, he often listens to like the great courses before he goes to bed. He's an atypical, he just turned 14, and I've worked in a lot of schools. He is quite atypical compared to same age peers.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a reason for asking. I'll tell you later in the conversation.
Okay.
Okay. So that is quite I feel like I noticed this pattern with a lot of my guests. They kind of start out in one way, and then, they take the windy path, and then they're in another place, and then they just, they stay there for, 20, 30 years or whatever. So it's always interesting how life treats us all the time.
You gotta roll with it.
What's interesting for you is that you've stayed pretty much in the same kind of nucleus of sorts, right? So maybe you're not doing the very traditional kinds of ways, your school, research, professorship, et cetera, but you're still in the world of psychology, and specifically school psychology, and all the different modes or modalities of learning. So that's really cool that despite your personal changes or your life changes, that you're still able to do what you're passionate about and what you like, and maybe in ways you wouldn't have thought so when you're in school, which is really nice. It's nice to see that you still do what you like and what you're passionate about, and still are a mom and spouse and all that stuff.
It's been I like to think about, like, my goal was to become a professor, and that was what I thought I wanted to be, and because I love research, I love teaching, I love connecting with students, and I love writing, and I've somehow been able to craft different pieces of those things together in a different way, which kind of meets my sort of need for this, like, intellectual stimulation, which is, I feel very grateful that I've been able to do that. And it didn't happen immediately. Like I said, this has been a long journey, but I'm finally to the point where I feel like I am able to, like, connect all the pieces that I really enjoy while still being, like, the main homeschooling parent. My husband helps too, but he works full time. So, yeah.
So let's start with school psychology at large, and that will be our kind of context, and then we can drill down to some of the other pieces. So I usually explain to people that don't understand or don't know about psychology in terms of the divisions within it, that there are four or five major categories within psychology. For me, it's usually clinical psych, school psych, industrial organizational, or business psych is kind of a colloquial term for it, and social psych. I don't know if I'm forgetting any. I mean, there's specializations outside of those, but those are usually the four major. I might be missing one, but
Sometimes people consider like counseling psych a little bit.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yes. That's the other one. Yes. Thank you. Counseling psych. Yeah. So those are the five. You can obviously have neuropsych, forensic psych, family or groups, you can, and then you can have even further divisions within psychology. So some people like to spend their time with psychoanalysis or CBT, and then they just take a certain type of therapeutic orientation, et cetera. But in terms of the big five fields or subfields of psychology, it's counseling, school, IO, clinical, and social. Is that, you would agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good way. I can think about a couple different ways to categorize it. That's definitely one way. And I mean, I think sometimes I'm talking to people about understanding like just the experimental versus the applied as well, right? Mm-hmm. Like that whole kind of, with the school and the clinical and counseling and IO, it's like more on the, usually on the, not always, but those are the psychologists that would be more likely to be applied versus, other fields within psychology, like social psych, even just developmental psychology, all different, all the other ones we teach about, but more on the experimental side, they're not actually working ever face-to-face with individuals. But of course, there's all kinds of overlap between all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I'm from the clinical psych world. So, it's a little bit different framing. So you're in the school psych world. So, it's interesting. I trying to explain this to people would be a little bit difficult because they think, oh, it's just psychology. And it's like, I don't really know a whole lot about school psych. I know a handful. I know all the things that you learn in graduate program and, things that, work I've done on my own. But, I have some colleagues that are school psychologists, but I don't play in that world too much. Right. So I don't know if you've played around in the clinical world either, but, so just kind of define for us, I mean, you kind of did in the intro in the beginning, but define for us school psych and what it typically looks like and its primary functions and uses and all those things.
Right. So school psychologist, like I mentioned before, is somewhat of a meshing of some stuff from clinical, but not quite as in depth as clinical psychologists go usually. Some from counseling, the counseling world, and a lot from educational psychology, which is usually thought of as more of one of those experimental, kind of branches of psychology where you're not working as much in sort of direct contact with individuals, but understanding a lot about how children, usually children, sometimes, I worked even a little bit in university settings, but how children are functioning within the school setting and in what way you can improve that functioning, in what way you can improve the school functioning. So in some ways, there's even some components of school psychology that would blend along a little bit with like organizational psychology, because sometimes school psychologists are called upon when there's like some organizational issues that you have to figure out as well. And it's really fascinating just in terms of the, the day-to-day or how it usually works. And I worked as a school psychologist in many different states. So, like from Georgia to Pennsylvania, to Maryland, a little bit in Virginia, and knew a bit about DC because I lived in the DC area at that time.
And Maryland was the best, obviously.
Maryland is great. I worked in Montgomery County Public Schools for a short time. And
one of the top public schools?
Yeah, it's a great school district. So that's a big piece of it. School psychologists usually aren't assigned to one school. So usually you're assigned to like 3 or 4 schools, which can be overwhelming. And depending on the school district, like in Georgia, I had like an office within a school itself, but a lot of times, like in Montgomery County, school psychologists are in like the administrative offices. You've got all your test kits there, and you have to take them to all different schools and stuff like that. Yeah. And so I worked from like preschool age all the way through 12th grade in most school districts. And even like alternative schools I would have assigned to me as well. And so it was a very varied population that I was working with, and fascinating, right? Like it was always so different to be with a kindergartner versus like, a little kindergartner who's all fun, and then going to like the 10th grader in the alternative school, right? Those are really, really different experiences.
Very different. Yeah, very different.
And I loved it though. It was really great. And a big part of the job, as I said, too much of the job, in my opinion, at that point, and still unfortunately that way, was about diagnosis. I mean, I think that should be part of the job, but it's in a lot of places, it's become too much about that and not as much about sort of preventative things. Like I wrote a book chapter with a professor about, how we can, develop more preventative practices within schools, because I think that's really important and something that we often overlook. We're often catching things after the fact rather than really trying to prevent them. And so, but within this, a big part of what I did was also develop interventions for students who are struggling. Most of the time, it was kids who were struggling academically, behaviorally, socially, emotionally, probably more so academically, and really working with teachers, working with parents, trying to figure out how to make the school and the child, have a better experience within the school setting.
When you say that school psychologists heavily focus on diagnosis, how do you mean that? So does that mean that, okay, I'm going to be in a school and we're going to get all of the students lined up and we're just going to give them diagnoses, or is it a certain group of kids, or how is this selected for this? I mean, I have an idea, but just for listeners' sake, how does this usually work?
Teacher referrals, right?
Okay. So the ones that teachers think are the bad kids, right? They're the ones that get it, or no?
Yeah,
is it more
that's
than that?
most often. That's most likely the kids that are causing a lot of disruption.
Yeah.
Most of the time, it would be the kids causing more disruption necessarily than the ones that might be the most academically struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And a point to bring up about this, because it's something that I feel is something we need to talk more about, is that probably 80 to 85% of my referrals across grade levels were boys, right? Mm-hmm. So that was always interesting to me. And of course, especially within elementary schools, where I did probably the majority of the work was in elementary schools, depending on the school district I was in. And of course, the majority of teachers are what? Female, right? Yeah. So that's an interesting dynamic going on that I think we need to look more into and understand more about why, there's such an overrepresentation of boys in the special education system. And so teachers would, there's like all kinds of processes depending on the school district. They would have like what's called a student support team, right? And initially a teacher would bring a student and say, so-and-so, we'll use the generic Johnny's having trouble in the school setting. I think that he's, not paying attention and he's unable to complete his work because he's not paying attention. Can you come in and observe him? And that would be like the first step, and we talk about, okay, what kind of, I'd go and observe him, figure out if his behavior did seem sort of aberrant compared to his peers in the classroom, and talk about some like kind of low level intervention ideas, strategies that the teacher could try, like things like proximity control and those kind of things to see if they would work, and try to collect data over a certain period of time to see if that intervention would work, or if we need to take it to like the next step within the student support team process, until you get the whole way to the end. And it's like a referral for possible, identification within a special education category. And, that's kind of how it goes. And what I always found problematic was it would often end up in going the whole way through the process, right? And going back to the research that I worked on as a graduate student with instructional consultation, what I love about that model is the idea that we can modify the environment a lot. And it's not always that there's something wrong with the child, right? That we need to diagnose and label them, especially when they're 5 years old, and put a label on them that will stick with them for a long time. But there are lots of things we can do in the environment within the classroom, or with bringing in other supports for the teacher without having to diagnose. And unfortunately, within a lot of schools, that doesn't happen as much as it should, right? Like the immediate focus is there's something wrong with the child rather than what can we do to change the environment. So that was always a struggle that I had. And of course, sometimes there really is something that needs to be diagnosed, and we really need to figure it out. But as a school psychologist, sometimes you're left with a lot of my colleagues are the same way. You're left with okay, if this child is not diagnosed with something, they will not get any support. And that to me is just, because it shouldn't matter if they get a diagnosis or not, if the child needs support. And I think there's still 8 categories of special education that you can qualify for. And, what was always really hard is if a child that was really struggling academically, especially, and they didn't qualify for any of those 8 categories. And then it was like, well, they don't qualify for special ed. I guess I don't have to do any sort of interventions, even though they're failing every subject, like those kind of things. So those are some of the frustrations that you run into. And now that's sometimes it was like that. And other times there were absolutely amazing, wonderful teachers that would do anything they could. Didn't matter if the child was diagnosed or not. I come from a family of teachers. My sister's still a teacher. My mom was a special education teacher. So there's tons and tons of teachers that'll go above and beyond whether or not there's a diagnosis. But that's a big part of what happens in schools. And I see it's a big problem that oftentimes there has to be a diagnosis for a child to really get assistance that they might need.
So it sounds like for school psychologists, primarily, not entirely, primarily there's from a school-based, kind of school-wide, I guess you could say, idea of this reactionary kind of way of approaching things, right? So something is problematic, so fix it. Or
right.
See, do they qualify to get certain types of accommodations or certain types of services? So school psychologists have, it sounds like, a kind of broad net, right? Where it could be academic, behavioral, or other types of challenges they may have. But it usually sounds like it's in response to something,
yes.
Right? That there's a need and there's a response. Now, I kind of have two questions at the same time. So in the aspect of diagnosis and or some kind of low grade interventions, there's a heavy emphasis on completing psychological and academic assessments, correct?
Yes.
Now, the question I have for this is, academic assessments I could understand. I could understand cognitive assessment. But why would it, or what are your thoughts on school psychologists doing other types of assessments for children within a school setting, right? Why wouldn't it be, hey, listen, we want to make sure this student, as part of the school in this classroom, is doing well academically and behaviorally, but it's not your place. If the parents want to do that or caregivers want to have their child assessed, then that should be their right. Why are teachers or administrators suggesting to psychologists to do certain assessments? Kind of, if there's things, I'm thinking more along the lines of personality assessments,
right? Behavioral rating scales and that.
Yeah. How do you think about that?
Well, as a parent, I probably think differently than I did when I was a school psychologist in the public school setting. I think what happens is a lot of times, and depending on the school system that I was working in, it was the only way that the child was going to get support, right? It was the only
in terms of like special education,
right? In terms of like, so within special education, there's like what's categorized, depends on the state, but it's often called like emotional or behavioral disorder, right?
Yes.
And that would cover things like depression, anxiety disorders, and all the, a lot of the things that you are probably diagnosing could fall under that umbrella of emotional behavioral disorders. And so, and a lot of times those are the presenting issues, right, within the school setting. And so that is, in school psychologists are generally trained pretty well in assessment, even in those areas.
Sure,
but
sure.
I understand what you're saying is like, is that the role of the schools, right? And that's a much bigger question.
Right.
And, I, as a parent, that isn't what, I feel like the role of we homeschool now, but that wouldn't be the role of the school that I would think as a parent. But as a school psychologist working in the schools, I also recognize that not every child, and more than we would ever want or hope for, don't have family situations in which they're able to get resources outside of the school setting. And so I think that's what I think most teachers are bringing these issues up in an effort to figure out how to best help the kids in the setting where they're spending a lot of their time each day. And I think what you're saying though is a big issue. Like we think about in terms of what is the role of education, what is the role of schools. And I mean, as we've gone through COVID, right, that's been a huge thing, right? Like it's not just that these kids are losing out on, a lot of them are losing out on 9 months of learning math. A lot of them are losing out on some of these other additional supports that they received in schools. And then and even beyond that, going to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a lot of the kids we were worried about getting those, getting their food needs met and that kind of stuff. So it becomes, this is a huge issue. And I think a lot of people feel very differently about it, about what the role of education is, what the role of schools are in terms of, broader than teaching reading, writing, arithmetic kind of thing. And it's definitely a controversy. So I don't know. It's a hard thing to understand, but I think very different people have different ideas about it.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on having this conversation, but here we are. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, of course, right? I mean, I'm pretty biased. You're pretty biased. Like, I can't tell you how many psych assessments I've done, how many you've done. I mean, I'm fairly ethical. I'm going to assume you're fairly ethical. We have the best interests of the student, client, but if I think about it, right, from a parental standpoint or from an objective standpoint outside, our career and our profession, I could definitely see people's animus towards some of that.
Yeah, and I think I should emphasize, I mean, there is always parental or guardian, consent, right?
Sure.
But to the extent of what they understand is also another issue, right?
Right,
in terms of what you're actually doing and what that, I would always, as a psychologist in the school setting, try to call up parents and make them understand this is sort of the battery of the type of test that I'm going to be giving, and that this is, what, kind of potentially we're looking for, so they could have a clear understanding. And and that can be a really big challenge though, because I had lots of meetings where you came in and parents did sign consent and they thought they knew what was happening and stuff in the school setting. And then they're kind of caught off guard. And that, it was always really hard for me. Like I always tried to be the advocate and sit beside the parents and stuff, because if you haven't been a parent that comes into a school setting, and a lot of the times parents that are having kids that struggle in schools were also had struggles in schools themselves, right? And you come into this meeting and there's like 12 people, including the principal, the assistant principal, people from central office, the teachers, everyone coming in together to tell you, like, this is how your child's struggling. It's so intimidating.
Yeah,
and so I would do whatever I could ahead of time to sort of prepare parents for that. And like I said, try to be the advocate specifically for the child. And oftentimes, school psychologists get put in a situation that's rather challenging because you are an employee of the school district, but oftentimes you're more of an advocate for the parent student, right? And sometimes there's a big rift between the two, and you've got to figure out how to navigate that. And that's a huge challenge for school psychologists.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm sympathetic to that a lot. But okay, so switching to the other side here, man, school staff, from administrators to teachers to people working in the lunchroom to, nurses and school psychologists, they have a hell of a task having hundreds of kids every day and, having to deal with, each child is an individual, small person, and they, there's I would say the primary thing is the academics. But then there's all the other aspects too, which are social, emotional, behavioral, and then all the shit they bring from home and community and, all that stuff.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really, there's so many things. And you just say, okay, now just go to this building for 6 to 8 hours a day and, learn some things. And that's a lot of stuff going on at one time. And so you want to try and catch things that are, that go wrong or that become maladaptive, or that there's something not typical, or something that you don't want to see, or some poor behavior, or some, or I think about a lot of the times, which you probably have done a lot and which you probably recognize is, how do you spot, specific learning disorders, right? In reading, math, and written expression, right? Like those things hide really well. And how do you within the diagnostic criteria, you need some type of academic or achievement measure or psychoeducational measure, whatever, to assess for that. So, you could sit here and impress us with how many times you've given the Woodcock Johnson, how many times you've done it, right?
Not impressive. I preferred the Wyatt personally.
Did you? Oh no, I like the long form, just kind of on everything. That's kind of very on brand for me. Long form on everything. The Wyatt is cool, but it's too short. I like it.
It's been a long time. Well, are you usually with children, or are you usually assessing older kids?
Well, both. I mean, for all. I think again. I mean, I can't remember the age qualifications, but when you're doing achievement testing, I like the big WJ or WISC or whatever.
Yeah.
But how you're catching certain things that normally wouldn't, and they need help. They need help if you have some neurodevelopmental disorder, so specific learning disorder, or stuttering, or autism, or ADHD, or anything in that category. So there is an importance and a need for school psychologists to provide full assessment batteries, and have a diagnosis, and probably more importantly the recommendation and feedback to parents and teachers. There's a big need for it, no?
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a huge need for it. But I think that we do get a lot of that happens, but I would also suggest that there's a huge need for the preventative measures. And we'll talk about a specific area that I was really interested in when I was initially a school psychologist before I went back. I'm still interested in it, but it was like my initial interest was in teaching reading, right? So like the research in reading, we have decades of research now on how to teach reading, especially to struggling learners, and the importance of phonemic awareness and phonics and all those kinds of things. National Reading Panel came out with all this research. That was probably like in the early 2000s, compiling a meta-analysis of all these studies that have been done. We know how to teach reading. But and this was a frustration I had within a lot of school settings, there was not an emphasis on adopting curricular materials that were in line with what the research says. And I would get frustrated over and over again with, like teachers meeting together to adopt like the reading curriculum, and I would come in and I did presentations. We talked about other roles, other things. And it wasn't school psychologists just did assessment. I did all kinds of different things, counseling, lots of presentations to teachers and stuff about research. And I was really an advocate for helping teachers understand, especially because so many kids are struggle to learn to read, right? And telling them we know so much. And it isn't that there's a lot of information out there that, kids are getting diagnosed with specific learning disabilities and reading decoding, right, at early ages. And really, with good interventions at young ages, they will not look like they're going to have learning disabilities in reading later on. Yeah. There's a book by Dr. Sally Shaywitz, Overcoming Dyslexia. It's like one of those books that's like changed my world in terms of understanding dyslexia and how good interventions can, actually change kids' brains, right? Like we think, oh, this kid has dyslexia, specific learning disability in reading. There's something that's different about their brain. Well, yeah, that doesn't mean that we can't change it, right? And so fascinatingly, I kind of skipped over this part in my little history of myself from the time I I was a school psychologist in the public school setting. Before I went to the University of Maryland doctoral program, I worked for a year at a neuroimaging lab at Georgetown University called the Center for the Study of Learning. And I administered like all the neuropsychological assessments. And then we were combined with like functional neuroimaging of individuals with reading difficulties and autism. And hyperlexia. So hyperlexia is sort of the opposite of dyslexia. Those kids, our kids were kind of, especially my older son, was super hyperlexic. He was reading well before he was potty trained. So, which was interesting. We ended up with a child like that. But so I was part of this study where we were seeing changes. We were utilizing different reading techniques to help kids that were struggling with reading, and they were seeing functional neuroimaging changes within the brains of these kids that were going through these reading interventions. So going back to the school setting, trying to help teachers understand those kind of things and understand that there's ways that we can prevent seeing some of these difficulties they're seeing with these large groups of kids struggling with reading. Or like another issue that I felt really strongly about was bullying. I worked on it when I was in my master's degree program. I was a research assistant for a bullying program. And I felt really strongly about going in and, just making people, we had, different steps that we used called the second step curriculum to help, people be more aware of things that were going on and to help kids that were struggling with being bullied and that kind of thing. And again, within schools, focusing more on, programs that have a research basis. And there are all kinds of wonderful resources now, the What Works Clearinghouse. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's they go through reading curricula, math curricula, bullying curricula, and they go and they find the ones that have real evidence, they've been through the randomized controlled trials, more than one, they've replicated and all that kind of stuff. And you can go and you can look up, if this is a program that I should adopt within school settings and stuff like that. Unfortunately, and it's been a while since I've been in the public schools, but most of the time that wasn't what people were looking for, right? In terms of the curriculum that they were adopting, or even thinking about preventative measures. As you pointed out earlier, so much of the time things are reactionary, right? And, and that it just doesn't need to be that way. And of course, there are going to be the kids that you do need to evaluate and are going to get diagnosis. But if you put in the preventative measures, and the best preventative measure is a good curriculum, right? In terms of preventing academic struggle. And I will go a little bit off topic a little bit. Another thing that I feel strongly about in terms of a way that we can help broader swaths of kids, individual kids, because I really think about education is it's not one size fits all. No matter what we want to do, we are all so different, and our kids are also different. And that's where this whole school choice comes in, right? Which is a totally hot topic. And I'm a strong advocate for public schools and for school choice. I believe that there are kids that aren't going to ever have as much success as they could in a regular public school setting as they could in some sort of alternative charter schools, magnet schools, those kind of things, or homeschooling, hybrid homeschooling. There's so many different options now. And I found that a lot of kids that are having some struggles and difficulties, if they've had to, been able to change the environment a little bit, they've had a lot more success.
I'm trying to see where I want to go with that. Yeah, this is something that people do get animated about. Mm-hmm. It sounds like what you're advocating for is a type of all options approach.
Yes.
Right. So you're not saying that we shouldn't have public schools. You're not saying that we shouldn't have charter schools. We should have all of them probably, or different methods of education. But that there's that people have an element of choice in the matter, right, in terms of what's educated. I guess which I agree with that. But I guess my slight pushback is how do we have choice with a sense of scale? So, if everybody wants to go to a charter school, if everyone wants to be homeschooled, or everyone wants to, how do we scale that across 50 states and 8 or 9 territories, whatever it is in the district? How do we have an infrastructure that is regulated so there's basic minimum standards that everyone meets? For example, if one, there is challenges with our education system, at least in the United States, there's people that graduate from high school that aren't literate, right? And that's in any school. That could be in a public school, a private school, homeschool. That's just, that's one issue, right? There are multiple issues, and I mean, you're not running the Department of Education, but how do you, you know,
Maybe I should be now.
I get the whole school choice thing, and I really do. But you know, how do we have at bedrock from a functional, efficient, foundational level some bare minimum that everyone is meeting? I mean, because if it's too disparate, that's not good either. You don't
It's
want
already
that.
disparate though. Check out.
It already is disparate, but you don't want it to be that way. You don't want it to be
No.
more.
I mean, I'll touch upon what you're asking to my best of my ability. But what's fascinating is when you look at, like all states now have adopted some sort of state standards where you have to like, you're below minimum, you meet the criteria, or you exceed the criteria thing.
Right.
Those tests across states are so different, right? Like they're so much harder in one state versus another. So what's minimum criteria in one state versus another is like, we can't even say there are, they can in any way be held as equivalent. And that's why we have standardized measures, right? That are, things that are, not criterion reference kind of tests, but tests that are the same across everyone. And that's why we have those, because we have to have a metric. And there's so much pushback now against things like the SAT or any kind of tests like that, that do kind of give everyone the same yardstick. But if we don't have some sort of metric like that, then that's going to be problematic, I think. But going back to the scaling, well, what's fascinating is I've lived in, my husband's job has moved us around a bit. So we've lived in, from Georgia to Maryland, DC, Pennsylvania, Colorado, California, now Utah. Okay. So I've seen a lot of different things. And what is really interesting across different states, there's much more openness towards certain alternative choices. Like we lived in Colorado. There was a huge emphasis on, and the public schools worked well and were fine with charter schools. And there's a charter school for gifted kids. There are charter schools for kids that, are more into performing arts. There are schools, so it's almost like state by state, they already do it very, very differently. And even with homeschooling, interestingly, California, I found very innovative in terms of how they approach the homeschooling and are okay with it. And it is hard to conceptualize how we would scale it nationally. And I think what we can think about is, there needs to be some, if you're receiving public money in any way, right, then you have to have some sort of accountability. And that's what happens with charter schools. They have to be accountable in some way.
Right.
Private schools are a little bit different, right? And homeschooling, depending on the state that you're in, some states like New York and Pennsylvania, where I grew up in Pennsylvania, and my mom actually worked with the homeschooling kids as a special ed teacher. She was also part of like having to go check and make sure they were meeting their requirements. And they have really stringent requirements that like homeschool students have to take the same kind of testing, have to make sure they're doing all those things. And then other states like Utah, California, you don't have to have, you basically have to keep attendance.
I think there's some for homeschooling with different states, there's a certain tier system. So I can't remember the names, but there's like a high tier system where I think Maryland's one of them, right? Where you can homeschool in Maryland, but it's very regulated. They have to do a certain amount of tests, state tests. They have to have certain things that are checked on. They have to submit certain things, forms, whatever. There's like a second category, which is some of that less stringent, a little bit more open. And then there's like another category where it's like, basically like, free range. Like you could just do whatever you want. Like,
I mean, it's definitely like that. And I've been to all different I've been to different states. I've only homeschooled our own kids in 2 of the states, but it goes back to when you were asking about what is the role of the school in terms of educating our children.
Right.
If you're a family that decides to homeschool and you're not taking any money, like in California, you actually have the option of taking money if you are like more monitored. You get like a certain amount of money per pupil if you meet with a teacher once a month kind of thing. There's some different models for that. But if you are a parent and you take on homeschooling and you're not in any way getting funding and stuff, what is the role of the government telling you how to educate your child? So you can look at it that way too. You know what I mean? Like there's definitely a big part of the population that feels that not a big part. I'd say that homeschoolers are just the most varied group you could ever think of. They come from all different political backgrounds and stuff like that. But there's definitely some that are like, that isn't, I'm not taking any away from the government. In the same way that some private school parents feel the same way, that the government should be telling the private school what they should be teaching, that kind of thing. So,
well, yes, I mean, that's one way of framing the argument. I wouldn't quite frame it that way. I mean, I know people do. I mean, but and I'm not saying you are, but so let's I guess expand on this. So if I have a child and I'm concerned about what my child learns, right? Let's just keep it pure academics for a minute.
okay.
I'm very interested in the curriculum. I'm interested in their academics. I'm interested in what they're learning, what they're exposed to, what's being taught. I think as every parent nominally probably should be invested in.
True.
I might not have the capacity or the time or the ability or the bandwidth or whatever to homeschool. Like, I can't do that. I got to work, right?
Totally. Yeah.
My partner, my spouse, they have to, right? Okay, well, I need to send them to a school, right? Now, so I think there's this push-pull kind of thing of, yes, I want to send them, maybe I don't have a lot of money to send them to a private school for $30,000, $40,000 a year. But, I am concerned. And so public school is fine, but I am still invested in the curriculum and things like that. I just think this idea that, well, we don't want government telling us how to, educate our kids. Well, my response to folks that say that is, well, all those people that are saying that, are they going to stay home and homeschool them? Because I understand the reticence towards government overreach or government impacting, what's being taught or what's being done or things like that. But I think this is why a lot of people have kind of gravitated towards the charter school idea, right? Because we get a little money and we get to make our own decisions on how to do things. And it's very popular. I think my reading of it, I don't know how you feel about it with charter schools, is that it's a mixed bag. There are some that are run well and some that are run terribly.
Same, right. I feel exactly the same. Having been, our son went to a charter school in Colorado that was, specifically for gifted kids, and it was an amazing school, right? And how I look at it, like, I am a huge advocate of charter schools, magnet schools. I'm a huge advocate of people having choice, not just rich people having choice, right? Right. And I think that's what frustrates me a little bit. And I'm, and actually our son did go to a really well-known private school after we moved to California. And I felt very grateful that we had the ability to do that, but a lot of people don't. And just because you don't have the money to send your child to private school, I think you should still have choice, right? And as you said, very well, a lot of people can't homeschool, right? There's just they may not feel confident in doing it. They may really know themselves well that isn't really going to be a good fit, of course. Most of my family feels that way. They become a little nuts, right? But I totally understand that. And, financial reasons, all that. But I just really believe that it doesn't matter what your background is. You should have more than one option for your child in terms of school, right? Like, because I've worked in a lot of public schools, I know that there are some kids that aren't going to fit right in the regular public school. And I would love to see more options for them, right? More options for no matter what your background is, that kids have more choice. Or parents have more choice for their kids. So I think what you're saying about charter schools is true. They are a mixed bag in the same way that public schools are very much a mixed bag. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fascinating when people are like, this charter school needs to be shut down. Have you seen what their academic results are? And I'm like, okay, but let's look at the public schools right there too. They're not going to shut that down, right? And in some way, what I think is if you read any of my writing or anything, I'm super into like innovation and creativity and what can we do differently. And like, I'm like off the charts in my openness kind of on the big five. Like, I want to try new things. And I think charter schools can be an excellent way for us to try new things and see what works before we scale it. Right? You talk about that, like, what, could we scale different types of charter schools seem to work better in different areas of the country, and different, urban versus rural and that kind of thing. And again, my sister's a public school teacher, and I am a huge advocate for the public school for a lot of kids is an amazing experience. Right. So it's just, it's to not get so dug into, and I think we've talked about this before, maybe, or we've commented on each other's Twitter before about like, I'm not tribal. I don't want to be pulled to one team or another, and I'm not like a huge advocate only for public schools, or I think charter schools always, or I think everybody should homeschool. I think that humans are so different, right? We know about individual differences in psychology, and that applies to kids as well. And that, and to families, it's not just kids, it's to families. What's going to work for families, like going to the homeschooling. Of course, homeschooling won't work for everyone. It's amazing for our family, right? And I feel grateful for that. And it's amazing for a lot of families I know, but that doesn't mean that it's for everyone. And public schools are great for some families and some students, but they're not for others, And I think, as we know as psychologists, so often it's so easy for people to like reflect back on, well, this is my experience, this is what I did, and this is what's going to work for my kids, or this is what should work for everyone. And I just don't think that's the right perspective in pretty much any domain, but especially in education.
Yeah, I would agree. Right. I'm with you. I'm with you. I do think that the element of school choice for parents and children or students is important. I do think that, and in principle, I agree with you. I think that a lot of the times we don't get the most out of students and all of their differences and their potentials, right? Because there's not resources in a school, or they don't have certain amenities for it, or they don't have certain programs. And that's unfortunate. And again, I still go back to this idea, though, of, right. I mean, this is really what this working in tandem with private and public sector thing is how to do that at a scale with 300 and probably close to 50 million people in this country over 50 states that are so wildly different is, I think, really challenging.
Right. It's just like anything, though. It's like, how can we ignite our creative processes to go to one of my favorite like quotes by Jerome Bruner. It's like, how can we use what we already know about education to go beyond what we already think, right? And so for so many of us, we went to public school. This is what we know. This is how school is set up. This is how we envision education, right? Mm-hmm. It's really hard for us to go beyond thinking about learning and in the way that we learned. And I find it fascinating as I've become, this is our 5th year homeschooling, and just really reflecting more and more about my own learning, and now seeing our 2 boys learning, and how much of it, how important things like self-direction, being motivated, and like, diving deeply into things that you're really interested in, and not necessarily following along exactly any sort of age or grade standards, that kind of thing. For some kids, that's a great thing, right? And it's going back to what you're saying, it's how we have to figure out how to reconceptualize this very narrow way that we look at educating kids, right? And I think what's really interesting right now is that COVID has made more people think about this, right? Sure. I think, you asked, how can we do this? Well, obviously, it's going to be in some way probably connected to technology, right? And in what ways can we utilize technology for what it's really good for, in terms of, like online kind of education, and what things is it not good for, and really figuring that out, and not being like, oh my gosh, I'm so over Zoom after a year that I never want to learn that way again. Maybe figuring out different ways that things are hybrid. I have a nephew who, he's now a senior in high school, and he told me he loved doing Zoom classes, and he was really excited that he learned that his school was actually, once they're back in person, they're going to allow them to choose, like you want to come in for certain classes and you want to stay home and do other classes and that kind of thing, giving kids, especially high school students, giving them more sort of control, giving them more, letting them know that they have more choice. Like, I'm a big advocate for children, especially as they get older and older into the high school years, just becoming more responsible for their own learning and getting more, autonomy and choice in what they're learning and stuff. Because, what I know from psychology, what I know from being a parent, is that really increases their motivation and stuff like that. So I think it's really like that, going beyond what we know, going beyond, and it's hard. It's hard to figure it out. But I will tell you that not allowing choice, not allowing alternatives, trying to stop any sort of change is not what I think we should be doing. So,
Yes, no, I again, I agree with you in principle and abstract. I think it is very complicated. It is a very complicated,
so complicated.
issue.
Everything.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about school choice a little bit, and I think we mostly agree. I feel the pool of different forms of learning. Again, we're mostly talking about, I would say, primary school, right? So elementary, middle, high school for folks in the US. So we touched on it. So there's public school, there's private school, charter schools, homeschooling. We have Montessori, which is an interesting one. What else? What am I missing?
Magnet schools.
Magnet schools, some technological schools. Would that fit in there too?
Yeah. Lots of times magnet schools and charter schools are still technically public schools. They have a lot more autonomy in determining what they're like teaching and but
curriculum
still
and resources and stuff.
And most of the time, charter schools are based like solely on lottery kind of things. Magnet schools are more often based on some sort of admission. It could be like it's a performing arts school or really academically oriented type of school. And sometimes in certain states, charter schools are like that as well, that there are some admissions kind of standard, but it's usually not that way. Almost always, in my experience and my knowledge, charter schools are based fully on lotteries, right? If you live in that area, you can put your name in the hat, so to speak, and you can become a student in that school. A lot of times, some of the high performing charters, it's really hard to get in, right?
You have to be one of the elect.
And then there's more and more hybrid options, right? And more public schools. Like we live in Park City, Utah, and we totally homeschool, but they have all kinds of options that you can do different online schools either through the school district or through an outside vendor, and it's like you get some funding for that. I think. Like in California, same thing. You can go through what are different charter schools they're called, but really they're more like kind of like assistants that give you guidance on creating the curriculum, creating the materials for your kids and stuff. Like a lot of parents I knew utilized homeschooling through a charter school because they did want more guidance. They wanted a certified teacher to kind of give them kind of more idea about what they should be doing and that kind of thing. More and more like fully online schools too. Which is really interesting. I've seen a ton, more crop up, of course, over the past year. And like where I teach through what's, it's like an online vendor. I wouldn't call it fully a school. And it's geared towards kids that are more like, that are homeschooling. But I have students that aren't totally homeschooling. Some of them come out of school and they still take my classes. But it's fully like live online. Like I meet with them in a live online session, and then they have assignments all through the week and stuff. And it's like, that's where I was teaching AP psychology before, and I'm probably going to be teaching just an introductory psychology class there next year. And you can sort of take, and that's what my older son has done a lot through those different types of vendors, sort of like figuring out what he wants to take. As a homeschooling student, he does a lot of like online learning because I can't teach him AP calculus, even though I took it, back in 1994. That's why, in terms of homeschooling now is so different than it was like when I was a kid. And because of technology, there's so many ways to connect. And like my son, he has different people at this point, he has a retired teacher who kind of meets, if he is struggling with his calculus class or he's in physics as well, like he can turn to his online tutor and they meet via Zoom and, discuss kind of the things that he's struggling with. So there's like, technology really has opened up the world a lot in terms of education. And what's fascinating about homeschooling or online schooling at this point is it can be really expensive, not really expensive, but it can be kind of expensive, or it can be free, right? I don't know how familiar you are with like edX classes and Coursera and like the MOOC classes. Like, so like you can go, if you want to take intro psych from some of the professors at Harvard, like you can go and take it for free. You know what I mean? Like you can get you can get, like, this is what my older son and I do together. Like last summer, we took the philosophy of science through the University of Pennsylvania through Coursera, and we did the certificate kind of thing. Such a good experience. Like we do like the great courses and stuff all the time. This year, this summer, we plan on taking like an intro to economics class together. And like that, those kind of things are just so neat. And it's not, you can, if you have an internet connection, and if you don't have an internet connection, you can go to the library once it's open because of COVID, but there's so many different ways to access information. I think it's fascinating. We were talking about like pre-K through 12th grade, but thinking about how all these changes are going to affect higher ed too, right? Yeah,
that's a whole other.
I know. Yeah,
whole other labyrinth. I had one guest.
There's more and more online. Do you teach any online classes, or have you?
Well, not officially. This year everything's online, but no, not officially. I teach the graduate level in person, but yeah, this year it's been online. So
okay. So do you teach mostly grad students? Is that what you?
Yes. Okay. Those are the opportunities that have fallen into my lap. So yeah, I have nothing against teaching folks at different levels, but that's just the opportunities that come my way. So and I enjoy being a professor and stuff. I had a guest on where we talked about higher ed. She does a lot of research in this. She's wonderful, and she does a lot of good really good, important work on trying to understand all of the complexities of higher ed and where it's going at the moment. So
I mean, I'm interested in it from the perspective of like, I've been a professor before, but sure. I'm also interested in it because I have a 14-year-old who's ready for college, right? So I'm, figuring out physically he's not ready for college, right? But intellectually, there's definitely asynchrony between where he is physically and intellectually, and even socially, he's very advanced behaviorally. But trying to figure out what's going to be the best option as we go through the next year or so in terms of maybe a fully online program. I don't know. It's like we're trying to navigate all that right now.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean that. Yeah. Again, I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so let's talk about homeschooling then for a little bit.
Okay.
You alluded to this, but homeschooling looks very different now in 2021 than it did in 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So maybe we were kind of talking about the kind of structure of it. So maybe we can start there and just kind of get more detail. But I guess you said you've been doing it 5 years and you do it with both your children. For you personally, why did you decide to do that?
Well, I never thought I would. we never thought we would, my husband and I. And it was kind of having kids that didn't really completely fit. And our two boys didn't really completely fit into the regular educational setting for two very different reasons, actually, too. Our older son was just, literally like 5 grade levels ahead in like first grade. You know what I mean? Like it was the point that it was really hard for the school to accommodate. And we ended up sending to a private school. It was really expensive. It was a great school, but they still weren't necessarily meeting his needs. But he was fine there. And we put our younger son, we knew he wasn't going to be a good fit at the private school that he was at, that our older son was at. And so we put him in the public school. And from like day one, it was obvious that, we knew he was a little bit atypical in terms of behavior, social, emotional kind of things. And from the beginning, it was the first 2 months in school for him in kindergarten. There were 30 students in class, one teacher. He was already reading and they wanted him to be just like cutting and coloring and that kind of stuff, all stuff that he hated. And unlike our older son that would do anything he was told, even if he didn't want to do it, our younger son did not. And, so he would, behaviorally act out and would feel anxious about going and all that. So by October of kindergarten, we're like, this isn't working. He's not learning. And he's just kind of starting to think of himself as the kid who always gets in trouble. So we decided to pull him out and homeschool him from, it was like immediate change in his levels of anxiety and just having just much more joy again. And what was fascinating was that our older son at that point was in third grade at this really highly academically oriented private school in the Bay Area of California. And he saw his brother being able to sort of like self-direct and pick kind of what he, I sort of gave him within a framework of stuff he could pick out when he was in kindergarten, and he was like, I might want to do that next year. And we're like, really? Because he'd always loved school. And he's like, yeah, I think it would be really cool to see, to be able to pick and choose kind of more of what I want to do and really focus. Because he's always had a really strong interest in many academic subjects, but really history. He just has so much knowledge about history. In most elementary schools, they're not learning about the British monarchs. and so, we let him try it, and he just has loved it. And it's been really probably even more amazing for him to sort of take on and self-direct and choose the classes he wants. And he took online classes, and then contacted the owner of the company and was like, I'd love to teach classes as a junior instructor. And that's just all been so amazing to watch unfold, that, he started at 12 years old teaching other kids, right? Like creating his PowerPoints and, doing all the research, everything that we do to get prepared for classes and communicating with parents. And it's been, I feel so grateful that he's had this opportunity. But so that's a big part of how we ended up homeschooling and where we are now. And with our older son, I started off with both of them doing more hands-on stuff with me, like helping them and teaching them. Our older son now is mostly doing things either like completely self-directed or like more structured online classes. Like he does like different online classes in physics and calculus and American history and Shakespearean literature and that kind of thing. And then we work on things like writing and stuff like that together now. And with my younger son, I generally am still, one-on-one teaching him a lot of the day, but he's someone who requires a lot of recess. He requires a lot of playtime. So for my older son will be in his room working, or with me working for hours and hours and hours, and it's always been like that. And my younger son, he'll work in small little stretches, and then want to be outside playing for a long time and then come back in and stuff. And we have the flexibility to be able to do that. But homeschooling can't really be defined because it is so different. Like we know so many different people that homeschool looks completely different. A lot of people, and we did some of this early on, they're what are called co-ops, well, not now because of COVID, but they're like co-ops where a lot of times it's parents that have specializations in like, science or math or whatever. They go in and they'll teach a group of homeschoolers, and then the kids can like hang out together. Initially on, we did some of that when we lived in the Bay Area and stuff. And that's great. A lot of parents do a lot of that kind of stuff. There's so many options available now, especially when we were in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was really cool because I don't know if you've been in that area at all. Like my husband's in the tech, in a tech field, and there's just this whole like, hacking idea, right? If something's not working out for you, you're going to figure out how to create something better. So this whole model of like hack schooling, like I'm going to create this school isn't working out for my kid. I'm going to figure out a way to figure it out myself, to piece together sort of an eclectic model of education that will work for my child and my family. And there's a lot of that happens in the Bay Area because people, it's like, there's a general like thought of like that startup culture, you know what I mean? Like this isn't where I'm going to try something out. If it doesn't work out, we'll try something else. Right. Like, and any parent that's even considering homeschooling, I think you have to take that model. Like, I'm going to try this. I might even just try homeschooling for a year. And I've met a lot of parents. I have a friend right now. She's homeschooling and she's like, this isn't for me. I know this isn't for me. We're going to go back to the regulars, and that's fine. But be willing, you might want to be willing to try it out though. Yeah.
Were you nervous to start out doing that?
I wasn't nervous really. Well, my experiences are a little hard to like generalize because, my background is in education. And so I felt pretty confident in my, right. Skill set in a lot of ways, especially when the kids were younger, and being able to teach them topics, that kind of thing, teach them different subject areas. As they've grown, I sort of, they've taken more online classes with teachers that have specializations, but I am someone who I generally have a bit of a non-conformist sort of personality. So I'm okay with going against the grain, right? And, I had family members that were like, what are you doing? Especially taking our older son out of a private school that was like this really well thought of private school that so many people want to get into. And they're like, what are you doing?
Right.
And we're like, but my husband too, we're both kind of like that. We're like, we want to figure out what works best. And, and we're completely fine that if something doesn't work, we'll pivot, so I wouldn't say that we, have ever been that nervous about it. I do talk to a lot of other parents that do say things like that, like, oh my gosh, I would love to try something else, but I'm so afraid. There's definitely a lot of fear that, especially with homeschooling, because a lot of parents are like, oh my gosh, then everything falls on me, right? Like if they turn out badly, like you have to blame me, right?
Right.
And as we know, as psychologists, it's more complicated than that. This is a combination of environment and genetics and all kinds of things. But I guess it's my fault anyway if it's genetics here. But I think I've found that compared to a lot of people, a lot of other parents, my husband and I, we definitely have we're just okay with not doing the things that people like in our immediate surroundings are doing. And so when we were with a lot of people that were sending their kids to the regular public school and we're like, oh, we're going to send them, we're going to start homeschooling them. A lot of people were really surprised. But we weren't really that stressed about it. Like I said, I think we're of the mindset, if we try it out, it doesn't work and it doesn't seem like it's what's best for our family or for our kids, then we'll try something else. So.
What about because I think there's always the long-term piece of it, right? Where it's like, are they going to be well prepared to go to college? Are they, it's a heterodox, unconventional way, how are they, there's not the whole system of it, of school. Are they, are they going to be prepared if you're doing it long-term for, college and university and doing all of those components? Sometimes that's a concern.
Well, I think there's lots of different ways I can answer that. In terms of the unconventionality, I'll start with, really, the way that we're schooling now has only been for about the last 100 years, right? Most people were homeschooled. My son teaches the class on the American presidents, right? And he talks about all most of the American presidents were homeschooled at one point. A lot of people in history were homeschooled.
They had the one-room log cabin where they just had to write things on a chalkboard or whatever.
Lots of self-direction, self-taught, self-taught lawyer, that kind of thing. I think that compared to, again, what I knew, what my parents knew, what our grandparents even knew, it is unconventional. But in the big, long history of humanity, it's not really unconventional. Homeschooling, right? That's how most humans were taught. Most humans learned, right? In terms of long-term outcomes, there's actually more and more research continually coming out about how overall homeschool students often outperform. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? We know that it depends on who are the people that end up homeschooling, all those kind of things. But fascinatingly, a lot of different colleges and stuff are actually actively recruiting homeschoolers because of their, oftentimes because of their independence and their ability to take on, they're really, really interested in learning. They haven't ever, and how everybody homeschools differently, but in general, most homeschoolers haven't been force-fed information constantly that they didn't want to learn, right? They almost become more passionate about learning what they want to learn. Again, that self-direction, that ability to sort of, you have a project to take on, and this is something we really focus on, especially with our older son at this point, is you have to figure it out on your own. You want to teach this class, you need to figure out what are the pieces that go into this, and how you're going to connect with the parents, and you have to email the person who's your superior and all those kind of things. And I think that's from a lot of the homeschooling families that I know, kind of very similar, that they kind of, as the kids get older, they take on more, it's almost like they get more independence earlier, which is the opposite what I think a lot of people think about homeschooling. It's they think of these hovering parents that are teaching them everything. But in a lot of ways, it's my anecdotal experiences are, it's the opposite. As kids are getting older, they're getting more independence earlier on as homeschooling students. Because a lot of times homeschooling students too are taking, most states now, they'll let high school age kids take college level courses. So you have lots of homeschooled kids that are taking community college courses, starting at 14, 15 years old.
Hmm.
and having to learn some of those more advanced skills in terms of organization and that kind of thing, even earlier ages. So.
Yeah. So kind of going along with that, two other points. That is, the biggest criticism, or one of the biggest criticisms with people that are homeschooled is, well, what about their socialization skills, right? Or they, they're not with other kids, and they're not doing the whole kind of, system and of a school. And, what about, prom and homecoming in high school, and, first crushes and meeting at the lockers and under the bleacher, all that stuff, like, all that's gone and missed. And what about that?
Well, I will probably turn that on its head a little bit with what I tell you, but I'm going to begin with the fact that there are different, like there are homeschool proms. there are all these organizations and stuff now that these kids aren't losing out on those kind of things if they want to do them. They're not forced to do them if they don't want to. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my history. I was the homecoming queen. I was the prom queen. And I think that those social pressures actually changed who I was as a human being in high school. And I look about the socialization. We talk about it in terms of homeschooling, like in school, the socialization is always good. And having worked as a school psychologist and having been a student, I recognize that there's a lot of pressures in schools and stuff that are actually not things we want to be exposed to. And I think that, I can speak from my own experiences. I was very academically oriented, just like my older son as an elementary school student. And then I got to middle school and everything became about socialization. And, I played soccer too. That was like the big focus in my life. And it took me, the socialization, it actually took me away from, I think, who I was. And so I actually feel really strongly and really happy that I'm not seeing those same kind of pressures. We try to get our kids connected, and my older son is extraordinarily socially appropriate and good with meeting anyone. But I actually really love the fact that he isn't being exposed to as many of those pressures to just be cool. Like he's super nerdy and he's okay with it, right? Like he's completely fine with it. And I know that if he was in a school setting, like my husband and I were, that he would have different pressures that I think would probably change who he's becoming. So I think in some ways, in our situation, and isn't in every situation, we're very much of the mindset of we want our kids to grow up into who they are. Like we want them, whatever they are going to become, we're fine with it, right? But we don't want them to feel like they have to conform to any of these forces that are, that happen within the school setting and stuff. So, I think number one, the socialization question is kind of silly because there are so many opportunities and classes and all different sports. My older son played soccer competitively for several years. I think I told you today, we're doing like a board game group, there's skiing, there's all these different activities you can constantly be doing. It's not like we never leave the house. Like I always wonder about that when people are asking about like homeschooling families and socialization, like what they're picturing happening. But so there's that piece that you can get any kind of socialization you want, depending on, what the individual child is like. But there's also the piece of realizing that not all socialization is good. And that a lot of times what happens in schools is, kids are getting exposed to things that many parents, and I'm not talking about any sort of political things or anything like that, but it's hard when if you've spent any time in a middle school or a high school, there's a lot of pressures going on that are not necessarily good forces, right? And it's not necessarily the kind of thing you want to fully expose your child to all the time. So, I think it's, I think it's a complicated issue in some regards, but I think that some people just kind of forget about what their experiences were like. And maybe that isn't the way that we always have to do it. What was fascinating to me as I was pointing this out to my husband, it was like last week on Twitter, there was like someone asked a question, like, if you had to go back to high school, would you? Or like, if you had the opportunity to go back to high school, would you? Right. And literally 99% of the people responding were talking about how horrible their educational experiences were in high school. And I thought that was fascinating, right? Because those same people would then be like, of course I want my kids to do the same thing. I did it and I survived it. But again, it goes back to that, like, just because we did something one way doesn't mean that's the only way or that's the best way. You know what I mean? And you know, so, but of course it's difficult. And some kids like need more socialization than others, which is also another I don't know how you consider yourself on the continuum. I'm definitely more introverted. So in terms of like, I don't need as much socialization as like my older sister, who like literally could never homeschool because she couldn't be home all the time. You know what I mean? Like, so you have to figure that out for yourself and for who your kids are.
Yeah. Well, about me personally, I'm an introverted extrovert. I absolutely thrive off of people, and I can absolutely spend so much time by myself and be completely happy and content. So I'm weird.
No, I mean, I kind of get that, right? Like,
yeah.
Well, it depends on the type, right? Like these kind of conversations, great, right? Right? Like inane, like conversations about nothing or being in groups of people that are just draining the energy from you. Yeah, that's not what I want to be around. But like,
sure. Yeah. Well, I'll push back on the socialization piece a little bit. You know, you're saying, I mean, I hear you. I mean, look, I mean, high school was a shitty time. I mean, it's just, you know, there's a lot of garbage.
I wouldn't say it was shitty for me.
No, it's a lot of garbage things. You're learning about sex in really lewd and, you know, inappropriate ways at an early age. There's, you know, drugs and alcohol. There's bullying. There's, you know, sometimes crime and fight. I mean, there's a lot of horrible things in high school. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that, you know, I have this, you know, idyllic version of socialization in school. But you're saying that you're not exposing kids to that. You're saying, well, we're just going to take that variable out, right? In a school setting, you're taking out the social stuff because there's a lot of negative pieces about it. And an alternative approach would be like, well, being exposed to that, they could learn how to handle those things, and they could learn how to problem solve ways of, you know, making certain decisions about, you know, peer pressure, or, you know, how to handle, you know, certain types of, you know, quote unquote moral dilemmas. I mean, you could reframe it that way as well.
You totally could. And I think I should back up and say, like, we're totally not the parents that are trying to protect our kids from like the outside world. We're like extraordinarily open, kind of. Sure. We talk about like very open about talking about sex and all kind. Like we are. One of the reasons we homeschool is because we want our kids to be exposed to like a hugely wide variety of viewpoints, right? And we probably are too open about like the types of movies we let them watch and like situations that we expose them to, because we do use them as opportunities to then talk about like things like bullying, because they aren't experiencing it firsthand maybe in a school setting, although they might be in some other relationships outside of school. Sure. But we are very very, very, very open about conversations, even starting from a very young age about, you know, all the different things that are going on in the world. And we're not really big on limiting technology or like so while they're not maybe experiencing the day-to-day bullying kind of things, they know all about bullying. We talk about it. They watch all kinds of movies. We watch different, you know, YouTube channels, all those kind of things together. And, you know, watch the news, what's happening in the news and that kind of stuff. And like some of the big issues, you know, that we're talking about, like we're pretty much like with our older son, like talk about pretty much anything. And almost, again, I think there's a perception with homeschooling that there's like this overemphasis on protecting from the outside world. And in some ways, kind of, but in other ways, like for our family specifically, I feel like we're constantly trying to expose them to what's going on in the outside world from a variety of viewpoints, right? Like not just like you're only getting this viewpoint, but trying to make sure that they're seeing, you know, all different ways of looking at the world. And like I said, like our whole goal is like letting them grow up into who they really are and not feeling like pressured to go in one way or another based on, you know, whatever might be the conforming force at that moment.
Sure. Well, and to be clear, you know, I'm not personally pushing back. I'm just
I know. No, trust me.
General pushback.
It is an issue that people ask all the time. Sure. Like that's like the first question. Are you afraid about socialization? And I'm like,
sure, yeah. The one other I think element of it is like, well, there's maybe a strong emphasis on academics, and maybe it's just kind of having an adult child, right? They don't have a childhood, they become adults too quickly. They're dealing with mature adult themes too quickly, and they got to be kids. They got to push someone on the playground, and they have to pull girls' hair in the hallway, outside the locker, whatever dumb things kids do in school. Well, yeah, I mean, what about that, right? I mean, just having
we do have
adult children.
So we do have 2 kids. Sure. So that helps with that. I think that is harder. And I know a lot of people that have homeschooling one child and they find it a lot more challenging. So we have 2 boys that are 3 years apart, and they have a lot of physical play, a lot of physicality, a lot of, typical kind of those kind of issues. And again, with other activities that they're involved in, they get exposure to those kind of things. And if anything, like we've already talked more about my younger son, we didn't want, both of them really, like we wanted them to have a childhood. And so our older son was in this like ridiculously academically oriented school where he was having like 3rd grade, 5, 6 tests a week. If he wasn't, getting at least a 90% in all the tests, he moved down a group, and there's just so much pressure. Like he was like starting to have like 3 hours of homework a night in 3rd grade, and all this kind of like, what clubs are you in? Are you going to join this? You're going to do this? You're going to do this? And we're like, whoa, this is a kid who had so much intrinsic motivation for learning. And we were even starting to see like, he was just like getting angry. He didn't really exhibit it in any behavioral way. We could just see that he was starting to become a little bit less interested because for all these tests and just so much homework. And so we felt like that was kind of taking his childhood away. And we felt like we could sort of craft a way for him to be able to get his academic needs met without that external pressure. For our younger son, kindergarten, because he was struggling, I decided I was going to volunteer every Friday, all morning in the class to see what was going on and try to help, because he was having some behavioral struggles, and I'm a school psychologist. That's what I did, right? And I was just so struck by how little unstructured time they had, right?
Yeah.
There was no, like, he got to school like 8:00, and it wasn't until like 11:15 that he had a recess. Yeah. And then of course recess was even like, you can't do this, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. And it was just, so we felt like in what you're saying and having their childhood, we felt like the schools that they were attending were kind of doing that a little bit. And we wanted to have them take back the childhood. Yeah. And beyond the school setting, our families sort of decided that my husband and I both played soccer in college. Soccer was like a huge part of our lives, especially mine as a child. And our older son was really into soccer. And I don't know how much you're familiar with so many different sports nowadays, but if you're into a sport, it's like everything becomes revolved around it. Everything becomes, parents are just so intense now, right? Like everything, it's like, my kid's kind of good at soccer, my kid's kind of good at chess, whatever. And then it's all about, they're going to get extra tutoring, extra practice, extra this, you know what I mean? And we've kind of just stepped away from all of that to some extent. We're a very active family we're constantly traveling and outdoors and skiing and mountain biking and all those kind of things. But we want our kids to feel like they have a childhood. We don't want to feel like all they had was practices and extra trainings and tutorings and that kind of stuff. And I know different families feel very, very differently about that. I have some in my own family, but in terms of having a childhood that you can look back on and be like, I really had a childhood. That's one of the main reasons we did homeschool. So.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna tell you a story, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I don't talk about this publicly, not just because I'm embarrassed or ashamed or anything like that. I'm, like I said earlier on, I'm a very private person typically, which might sound strange, having a podcast that's heard around the world and stuff. But I'm typically a private person. When I was quite young, 3, 4, My mom became a pretty fundamentalist Christian, and that's how I was raised for much of my life.
Okay.
I'm not now. I'm an atheist, a human secularist. But I was raised that way for a while, and my mom was very concerned about what school systems, and we didn't have money when I was younger, so very concerned about public school systems and how they would educate students. And so my mom was very young when she had me, and so she said, "Well, I think I went to pre-K or kindergarten. I went to kindergarten, and before I went to like first grade, she pulled me out of school, and she homeschooled me."
Wow.
Yeah. And she homeschooled me my entire life. And it was interesting. So I could read at like 3.5, 4 years old. I mean, literally after I started speaking, I could read. And through a very series of interesting circumstances and events, when I was in high school, very young, even before that, I was able to go to a nearby college, and that's a whole other story of how that happened. And I graduated high school a couple weeks before I turned 15.
Wow.
I jumped a couple grades.
You threw me for a loop.
I think I jumped about 4 grades.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah. And it gave me a lot of really cool opportunities and advantages. And, I got my bachelor's at 19. That was pretty wild. And, as I did all my other degrees and everything. And so it's interesting because, I was being a little bit, a little coy with you, just because I wanted to see how you explain things. The conversation would be very different if I had told you that from the beginning.
Totally. So. Like I have preconceptions about you already. You know about those people that homeschool, right?
Yeah, they're all weirdos. They're freaks. Yeah. And this was, oh my goodness, a long time ago. I mean, it was
before homeschooling was cool, right?
35 plus years ago. So, it was really taboo back then. And, my mom was completely ostracized on this issue from friends and family for a while. And then people kind of got used to it. But it was one of those things where both my brother and I were homeschooled. And obviously we're different people. We're different individuals. I think I've always been kind of a nerd. I always have a big love for education and learning. And, I was very self-directed, very much so, very, very, very much so throughout my whole life. But just my personality, again, I'm terribly social. So I was doing a million and one things. I did every sport under the sun, different arts and different creative things and, clubs. And like I said, I was religious when I was a kid, church 3 times a week. So that was, super social and doing all those functions and gatherings and stuff. So, but there was definitely a lot of criticism and about it, both on the academic front and the socialization front, and growing up too fast and all that stuff. Are you going to be ready for the real world and for school and all those things? And
did you feel that you were?
Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. I turned out okay, I think.
Seems like it.
I did okay.
You're going to be my new poster child to talk about.
I did all right. Um, but there are some interesting things about it. Right before I was going to do, like, I guess I was technically middle school age. And my mom and, well, both my parents, but my mom specifically, she asked me, she's like, look, you can go to high school if you want. It's your choice. Like, if you want to do it, you want to do the whole thing, prom, homecoming, football games, all that stuff. And I thought about it. And then I said, well, I mean, I can finish so much earlier though.
Yeah.
And be done. Like, and I'm already hanging out with people and doing stuff. And so I was like, I went to parties as an adolescent. So I said, well, no, let's just keep going. I can finish, and so, I just think it's different for everybody. I think your point about choice and all that is apt here. I mean, homeschooling is not for every parent, and it's not for every child.
Definitely.
There are plenty of people where, I would not recommend it. It's just different temperaments and different personalities, and so I just think it is different, and it's not for everybody, but for those that it is, it can propel you to a lot of really awesome things.
Right. It's a choice that can be amazing for some families. And I think one of the things I didn't mention that you just mentioned, that we all the time in our families, we extend that choice, of course, to our own kids. And I'm constantly saying, if you don't want to be doing this, if this isn't what you want, because both of them kindergarten was a little bit different at that point, but our older son initially literally chose and said, this is what I want to do. But every year, even every mid-year kind of thing, we're like, are you sure this is what you want to continue doing? Right? Because this is about, you get to be, you're a big part of what creating your own educational path. And we want you to be responsible for that. And I think that you touching upon that is important, right? Like, I'm not an advocate for forced homeschooling, right? Like forcing kids to do something against their will. And there's definitely a lot of kids that would not want to be homeschooled. We've met some kids around here that are in my son's board game group, and they're like, yeah, we've tried homeschooling with COVID and he likes it, but he's really missing the school setting. So we're going to go back to it. You know what I mean? And that's right. Again, it's like that ability to pivot and stuff like that, and being open to change, and not thinking this is going to be forever necessarily, but being open to the possibility that it might be. But wow, I'm just amazed that was your journey. That's so cool.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have you on my YouTube channel next.
Totally fine. Yeah. I again, I don't talk about it mostly because I just don't really have a reason to. So I had a good reason to now.
Yeah, no, it kind of relates to everything we're talking about. So that's
So I mean, there's my experience. And my experience is what it is, and I'm happy about it. I'm proud of it, but I'm not an absolutist about these things. It's like, I had an awesome experience, so everyone should do it, and all that. I'm quite the opposite, actually.
You don't proselytize for homeschooling only,
no,
right? That's how I am too.
I'm not zealous about it. No.
Yeah, me neither. That's what parents expect me to be like. Oh, I think homeschooling is awesome for everyone, and I absolutely, as you said, there's a lot of people that I absolutely would not recommend it for, right? And but it's all about that whole choice and having options, and no matter what your background is, right? I've worked in school districts that are in such a variety of socioeconomic statuses, and I just would love to see more kids of all backgrounds have some choice, right?
Yeah, no, for sure.
Have options.
I guess the last thing that we can just briefly touch on here is, you've talked about your professional journey, you've talked about your personal journey. How do you see yourself now, and what all these you're doing so many things. You're writing and a channel, and you have a book coming out, and you have, all this stuff that you're doing. I mean, how do you feel about that? What are the things that you're passionate about at the moment? And then just kind of in looking towards the future, when your kids are out of the house, what are you going to do? Are you going to go back to academia? Or are you going to teach? Are you going to get tenureship? Have you thought about it that way? I mean,
my husband and I have gotten kind of used to, his job is pretty, he can kind of he works remotely now. And we've kind of gotten used to homeschooling and being able to travel and stuff. So I think it would be hard for me to go back to a traditional type of job at this point. I think what binds together all of the things that I'm interested in is this whole idea of, and I even have it as my tagline on my blog at Psychology Today, is sort of connecting the science of psychology to learning and life. Yeah, and I think what really motivates me is I love trying to take sort of complicated issues like translating journal articles and stuff like that, and making some of the more complicated psychological information across domains within psychology sort of more accessible to people. And it's kind of what I'm trying to do on my YouTube channel, kind of what I do trying to teach, right? That's why I like InterPsych, right? Trying to parse down some of the complicated information and make it so it's so psychology is useful to people, right? We know that there's so many things that I'm constantly I was just telling my dad, I'm okay, you're falling prey to the fundamental attribution error. And then taking those kind of things and helping people understand the ways in which what we know from research in psychology can really help them in their everyday lives and the relationships and the way that they parent, how they can utilize information that we know to become more creative. I think I talked to you about being interested in the concept of polymathy, and not only for ourselves, but I kind of talk about parenting for polymathy, because I think it's something that's really important that kids aren't necessarily forced to specialize in one area, that they may be really good at math, and really letting them dive deeply into whatever subjects they're really into, and if it's multiple subjects, but the overarching theme of me, of what I want to do, as I said, I consider myself sort of a psychological generalist, and I want to be, kind of connect disparate areas within psychology and help people understand what we know. And trying to do that, and Psychology Today is a great way to do that. Because the readership isn't necessarily always wanting the most technical information, so it's taking that information that is more technical and sort of translating it into ways that the general public can use. And it's actually been hard to translate writing that way. I don't know. Translate. It's been a challenge, for real. And even the book that I just finished edits. Hopefully I might have more, but it's called "Who the Hell is Piaget?" Right? And it's, I don't know if you have a daughter, maybe you've seen the books that are the "Who Was" books for kids.
I think so. Yes.
Who was George Washington? Who was great? So this is sort of a take. I love it. The publishers asked me to write this book, and it's a take on that for adults. So there's who the hell is Melanie Klein or B.F. Skinner or Friedrich Nietzsche or all these different philosophers and stuff. And it's taking these complex Piaget. It ended up being way more challenging than I anticipated. I thought I knew so much about Piaget. I've taught developmental psych, right? And taking their whole life story and everything, what for Piaget, what he, what his big ideas were, and sort of translating it into something that sort of makes sense to people that aren't psychologists, right? Or aren't even psychology students. But it's going to be something that the attempt is to kind of make it an interesting story for people that are non-scientists to read about who Piaget was and understand about who he was, or Melanie Klein or any of those ones. There's a bunch of books coming out, and I think it's a really neat idea. Because some if you've ever read, I mean, I know you have, some of the original writings by some of these psychologists, it's so, oh my gosh, some of them are so challenging even as a psychologist to get through, right? To read them is just horrible. So trying to take some of the big ideas and translate it, whether it's in my writing or whether it's in now even trying to do it on YouTube, within online teaching and those kind of things. And I'm kind of trying to bring it all together on my website, and trying to make it a place where I'm connecting the science of psychology to what I say learning and life, because I'm really interested in education a lot. but just in life in general, like how can we use what we know from psychology to improve our lives, all different topics. I'm really interested in creativity, motivation, like I told you, locus of control, those kind of things, things that we can, like big ideas that we know a lot about, but I don't, when I talk to people, I don't really think, I think sometimes I get caught, my husband tells me this all the time, I get caught in the bubble of thinking that people know these things, right? Like, it wasn't someone just, there was something on my, YouTube channel. I have a really basic article about research methods. It's like understanding psychological research, like really, really basic thing. And I'm like pointing out things like correlation doesn't equal causation. And I had conversations with a family member who's very educated and is, much older, and he's never heard that, right? Like it kind of surprised me, like to realize how many of these things that when people are reading research, that they really don't have an understanding of the difference between when we can tell when one thing causes another based on information, or when these just are variables that are related, there could be something else interfering. We don't know what direction the relationship is. Like simple things like that. I feel like if we can make a little dent in more people understanding those kind of things, can have a big effect, right? That's kind of my overarching goal. And I hope to sort of grow all these different things, from the writing to kind of presenting on YouTube and that kind of thing, and teaching, kind of grow them, just to kind of, connect more people to psychology and the science of psychology, really.
Yeah. Well, my goodness, we need people like you to definitely do that. And you have such a good background and such good training. So, that's something to put trust in. So it's really good that you do that. I have to say, it is such a delight to talk to you about all of this stuff. I was really looking forward to it, and it was everything I wanted. So I appreciate you taking so much of your time to share your passion, and both professionally and personally. I really value that. And, I can't say thanks enough.
Thank you.
I tell listeners where they can, all the many places they can find you and what you're doing.
Well, too often on Twitter, probably.
Aren't we all?
But I try not to be. I've been really, really trying to only log on twice a day and not get pulled into conversations. But overall, to find me, the best place to go is my website, which is Koehler Academy, Koehler Academy.com. And from there, you can kind of connect to my YouTube channel, the teaching that I do, articles that I write. Even I didn't talk about it, but in terms of the poly method, you probably see that I'm constantly sharing. I'm hugely into nature photography, hiking, being outside, nature therapy, all those kind of things. So I'm always sharing my pictures, and I love quotes from famous people and stuff like that. So all of it can be found and can connect to other places from my website. But yeah.
Okay. No, that's wonderful. That's great. I will put at least your website in the notes and maybe the individual links as well in there, but definitely where everyone can just click and find you. So again, I greatly appreciate you talking and giving me your time and your insights and your knowledge. I really, really appreciate it for that.
This has been a great experience. It's awesome to talk to you. And I even feel like it's been a long time talking, but I actually feel like it hasn't seemed that long. So that's a great thing. So yeah.
Alrighty. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Take care.
Okay.